Hello, everyone, for watching. Thank you for joining us. I am really excited to be in sharing this panel and to be in dialogue with our speakers, Anna Thomas and Alec MacGillis, to discuss the future of work. Particularly, as Nimi mentioned, each of us has published and been talking about this topic and have published something all within the past month. So this promises to be a dynamic conversation. Again, reminder to audience members, you can ask questions through Hopin. And with that, let me introduce our two speakers. Alec MacGillis covers politics and government for ProPublica. Alec's previously reported for The New Republic, The Washington Post, and the Baltimore Sun. He has won multiple journalistic awards, including the Robin Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting, the Polk Award for National Reporting, and the Elijah Paris Lovejoy Award. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, Atlantic, Bloomberg Business Week, and New York Times Magazine, among other publications. He's the author of Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America. Anna Thomas is co-founder and director of the Institute for the Future of Work. Anna was formerly a barrister specializing in employment law and appointed a counsel to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Anna was head of policy for the Future of Work Commission and is a fellow of IPR and RSA. She has co-authored several reports on the future of work, including last month's The Amazonian Era and Mind the Gap, which proposes new legislation and corporate obligations on algorithmic accountability. Alec, Anna, and I have each, from our own perspectives, been observing and studying the transformation of work, much of that led by tech companies. As Nima has mentioned, the ethos, practices, and business models in Silicon Valley, which emerged in the platform economy, sometimes also called the gig economy or sharing economy, have become mainstream in employment. And this has, in effect, reshaped the lives of millions of workers on both sides of the Atlantic. So this panel is called the Amazonian Era, but Amazon is just one example of a power that technology companies wield that make it possible to dramatically change how work is done in the future of work. So given that, I would love to start off with our panelists talking about where do you see this power coming from? What gives companies like Amazon so much influence over work and workers, and how? I'm happy to have Anna. Would you like to start with answering this question?
Yeah, sure. That's such a good question. I'm going to answer by focusing on why and how Amazon is so powerful in a work context, and offer some angles about work in addition to the sheer size and increase in employment share. So in the UK, there are going to be 5 new warehouses this year, and Amazon's moved into delivery and grocery business with Amazon Fresh and Amazon Go. But it's not just that. So as you began to outlined, Aiha, it's not just the US, it's not just Amazon, and it's not just gig work. So our research in the Amazonian era found that the logic, the entire approach, ethos, practices, as well as tools that of Amazon, we're associated with Amazon really, as well as used by Amazon, have actually now extended their reach to the furthest corners of the economy in traditional sectors. So we started with worker interviews in retail and logistics, but we've also now moved on to manufacturing, energy, and telecoms, and they've reached there too. And so we're looking at sort of both direct forms of power, but also indirect forms of power and influence too. It's a whole Amazonian era, a sort of qualitative shift towards the things that we associate just with Amazon. And so these, as you said, have been wrapped up and made available for download. We, as part of our work, sort of quite specifically on that point, we reviewed a new connected worker platform, which has grown like wildfire. That's a quote from one of the developers through the pandemic. And that can specifically be downloaded. So it's not just a metaphor from an app, and adapted to the 80% of the workers that are not sitting behind a desk. And that connected worker platform is at the beginning of what developers would call its hype cycle. And it coordinates information from a range of sources and offers management functions, traditional ones and new advisory and predictive functions. And it can actually even advise about changes to business models too. And the reason why it answers your question, Aiha, is that Amazon Web Services hold a 45% share of these connected worker platforms. And I think that's really interesting. and a sort of and goes to not just why but how Amazon is so powerful in the workplace as well as outside it. I've also talked to tech developers quite openly who told us that they were that they were working with these platforms in an experimental way, and the way they described it was to optimize people. So that they specifically said that they'd made as much as they could out of machines, and that the last big nut to crack was people. How can you optimize them? So this means that just really core decisions about work are being made through experimentation and through tech design, things that originate from Amazon or other similar places in Silicon Valley, not through well-designed policy. And yes, it's happening in the UK too. I'd love to say more, but I want to hear from Alec.
Yeah, Alec, if you'd like to add or even reflect on any of things that Anna may have said, and I would love to jump in at some point and respond to Anna as well.
Sure, I'm glad to, and I'm very glad to also to be here today. It's great to be able to speak to a more global audience about fulfillment. So much of, I would say, so much of Amazon's power, both in the workplace and in local communities, really does come from shifts that we've seen in economic geography in recent years. And my book, Fulfillment, really comes at Amazon from the regional context, kind of uses Amazon as a thread to look at how we've ended up with these incredible regional disparities in the US, but also in the UK and in much of Europe, with these, what I call sort of hyper-prosperous winner-take-all cities that have come to just so dominate in their national economic landscape and sort of soak up so much of the growth and prosperity, and with the result that you end up with all these sort of left behind cities and towns, not just rural areas, but also mid-sized and smaller cities. And we all know that the one part of that story, which is the story of deindustrialization and the decline of manufacturing in a lot of these communities, that has left them with so few good jobs. But now you've had at the other end this kind of this incredible kind of concentration of growth and wealth and dynamism in a handful of cities that have now got where you have the headquarters of the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks, kind of soaking up so much commerce and business activity from around the country into the places where they are based. And you end up with this incredible imbalance, like no imbalance we've ever had in the US, certainly, and an imbalance that's very unhealthy for both sorts of cities, and then you also end up with the left behind communities, cities and towns, feeling so desperate for any kind of jobs, any kind of employment growth, that they are in a very weak position when Amazon comes to town offering to build that warehouse or data center, and you end up with them giving away just extraordinary levels of subsidies and tax incentives to Amazon, despite the fact that it's quite confounding, despite the fact that Amazon is not in the best bargaining position, because it now needs to be just about everywhere to fulfill its promises of 1- and 2-day delivery. So it's not like it can just move to the next state over if you don't give it what it wants. And then of course Amazon is also very, very powerful as regards the local labor force. A lot of people just feeling like they have few options but to take that very, very taxing job that pays so much less than both the manufacturing jobs that preceded it, and in many cases also the retail jobs that preceded it. I would just say quickly 2 other points of power that for Amazon are it's in the US, it's extraordinary growth within Washington, D.C. Amazon's part of this national landscape that we have now in the US is that Amazon has picked Washington, D.C. to be its second headquarters, not just because there's a very skilled workforce there, but because it is, of course, the seat of federal power, and it wants to be there, wants to grow its sort of soft power that it's already built up with Bezos buying the Washington Post, and just hugely expanding the company's lobbying presence there. So you have this incredibly strong physical presence of Amazon growing in Washington, D.C. So much power comes from that. And finally, I would just add to that, let's face it, one big source of the company's power is the consumer. This is a touchy subject, but even before the pandemic, couple years ago, there was an amazing poll that came out, a serious survey that came out in the US showing that Amazon was the most trusted, the most admired institution in the country among Democrats. Ahead of unions, ahead of higher education, ahead of local government, ahead of the press, and was the third most trusted among Republicans behind the military and local police. And then, of course, last year, the reliance on dependence on Amazon just grew, exponentially among American consumers, to a degree that, arguably went even beyond the sort of public health demands of the moment. And so one big issue, one big challenge in confronting Amazon is that you have just this deep dependency bond between the company and the average consumer. The company is still held in much higher regard, generally speaking, than the other tech giants that are more in sort of the social media realm.
Anna, did you want to contribute to that? I felt like you had a point.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think those are such important points, Alec. But I think there may be another point that sort of complements them to show the kind of breadth and depth of the power working at different levels, sort of complementing what you've said about sort of national as well as international power and also regional inequalities. So the reaches of this power runs really deep at an individual human worker level. And so this happens, the means, sort of the how as opposed to the why this happens, is by means of a human data cycle. Details of that are in the Amazonian report. But what that shows is that there are 3 stages which will slowly change people's behavior. So it's happening. So these big picture things are in a sense mirrored in individual experiences and changes to individual behavior. So the first stage is increasingly invasive surveillance, capturing and representing what's happening in the workplace. So these can be sort of wearable headsets monitoring eyeball movements, really fine-grained location data, biometric data, facial recognition, that people have been acclimatized through COVID. That defines, so work becomes, in a sense, defined by what can be captured in this way. And then secondly, the algorithmic system will then set standards that are incrementally tightened. So you've got an amazing example in your report, Aiha, of Rena, who inspects 1,800 packages an hour. And we found out recently that even in Ocado in the UK, the task set at a rate of packing 500 bags an hour, which feels extraordinary. So info is being assessed by these kind of algorithmic standards. And the final stage is behavioral interventions over time, where people are nudged or effectively controlled by a range of incentives, which may be sort of Amazon vouchers, or requirements to meet goals that may be, for example, you have to reach a certain level of work or productivity, or what's deemed productivity, in order to earn your secure contract. So I couldn't resist adding that, but I know your report, Aiha, goes further in the States on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think what we found in both what the research that we did in the US and the UK is the kind of the conditions and the consequences that allowed for sort of this intensification of work and problems in the workplace are very similar. And I wanted to reflect on sort of Alex mentioning that when Amazon comes to cities, they're in a very weak position and they can't negotiate. And I think technical systems, since we're talking about sort of how data-centric technologies affect workers, are the same thing. They collect so much information about workers individually and collectively so that they can influence everything that a worker does, like Anna explained, such as that there's a complete imbalance there as well. So the ownership of this data and the ability of Amazon, because of their money and the local communities' sense of powerlessness, and maybe that's really the theme here, is really coming through in sort of each of the work that we do. I wanted to reflect on one thing, Alex. So I actually lived and worked in California before Amazon got a foothold, and California was actually able to say, no, Amazon, you cannot open a fulfillment center in California unless you actually pay the requisite taxes. This was a decade ago, maybe longer. But they have. And so my question is, since then I've seen changes, but only in a very regional way. How have you seen, and maybe I should take a step back and say, these like developments, both the growth of companies and the use of technologies is really not new. There's a whole history behind how algorithmic systems came about. And it started with Taylorism and sort of, the decline of urban centers, as you mentioned, as a result of deindustrialization, have kind of led to this point. But at some point, I guess there was a tipping point. Were we aware of it? And when did we start to see the effect? And what was the effect on jobs and inequality and communities? What have you seen through your work?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up California, because there's a really interesting story there with California that goes all the way back to Amazon's founding, which is why did they not start the company in California, in Silicon Valley, with the big tech companies? And one big reason that they did not start there was, in fact, taxes. Bezos started the company in Seattle because if he had started in California, he would have had to assess sales taxes in the biggest market in the country, and he didn't want to give up that advantage against his brick and mortar bookstore rivals. So really, in a sense, the founding of Amazon in Seattle is itself a story of tax avoidance. And only over time, as the company grew so big and got grew so popular, got so many customers, and then started making the promise of 2 and then 1 day delivery, did it become necessary for the company to basically put warehouses everywhere, even in the big states that it had been avoiding because of the sales tax calculus. So that's how we got to the point where they are now everywhere. And in fact, as you know, the Inland Empire of California, in the San Bernardino Valley, there is just ground zero now for Amazon warehouses. There are just more than one can count, just a sea of warehouses, not just Amazon, but very heavily Amazon. And so much of the ferment that we've been seeing among workers has been actually kind of bubbling up from that region. In general, about as the algorithms and gigification of work goes, I think it's just great that it's so useful for me to start to think of this actual work as gig work, and I think that's such a key connection. We often think of gig work as the Ubers and the Lyfts and the sharing economy type of jobs, but in fact, the more I've spent on Amazon, the more I've come to realize that it is itself a form of gig work, and it's actually it's seen by workers that way as well. I was talking to so many workers in this past year who were deciding to decide between staying at Amazon, going to Amazon versus doing Uber, and they're seen completely as part of the same kind of game, and that's crucial because it means that it's one reason why it's gotten so hard. Why it's so hard to organize at the warehouses, because a lot of workers have come to see these jobs just as with the lowest of expectations, jobs that they're just doing for the time being. They're not going to be there for long. They know it's incredibly grueling and rudimentary and repetitive and tiring, but it's just something they need something right now, so they go down to Amazon, just the way you might start driving for Uber. And that you see it in the turnover numbers. The turnover is just incredibly high. A lot of these warehouses, it's roughly a year on average, and so for organizers coming to that context, it makes it very difficult. It makes it very difficult to make the case that you should organize to make these jobs into something more sustainable, more middle class, more family supporting, more career supporting, when in fact so many workers are not seeing it that way at all. They're seeing it as something much more transit, much more temporary. And I really see that as one of the biggest challenges moving forward for organizing. It's not just that in the U.S. that the laws are so slanted against organizers. It's also that there has been that the gigification applies to Amazon just as it does to those more typical gig type jobs.
Yeah, just coming in on a couple of those points, if I may, on tax. I mean, there's certainly increasing concern in the UK too about Amazon not paying a fair share of tax. And one of our sort of larger unions, the GMB, have been leading a campaign on that. So that feels quite pertinent when for us that we're not even in the in the US. I think that the point you made, Aiha, about history is really super important, because the systems, the algorithmic systems that we're all talking about here, are trained on data that encodes that history of inequalities, those patterns of resource and human behavior. And the dimensions of data are increasing, and the pace at which the systems are working is increasing too. And so what's happening is that there's a real risk that we're shaping the future in the image of the past, or that we will do that unless we identify these risks and grapple with them and intervene appropriately to make sure that we can maximize opportunities for everybody and deal with these risks.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on something Alec said about sort of these jobs feeling more like they're becoming more gig. In our research, one of the things that we've found is technical systems through the nudges and behaviors kind of push the costs and risks of business onto employees, onto workers. So, scheduling technology, for example, is meant to optimize for the employer, but as a result, employees are now having to regulate their own schedules to meet the demands, the business demands. And so companies no longer have to weather the ups and downs of customer traffic, because employees will do it because of predictable scheduling. So definitely very much so, even though they're perceived as sort of full-time jobs, sort of the tools are really entering in this space. And I don't know if either of you have seen this, but at least for us, what we've seen is sort of there is an interesting dynamic related to race in racial inequalities that sort of get embedded, like Anna said, embedded into these tools, which rely on historic data, particularly if you're talking about, a hiring algorithm, which will pick up information about criminal background. Some would say, well, first of all, is that related to the job? In many cases, it isn't. But secondly, at least in the US, we know that rates of incarceration are very racially motivated. So it's sort of importing that into an employment context and leaving people out of employment. And I think that related then, I think you're both starting to touch on this, is sort of the impact on communities, and what can we do individually or collectively to address these sort of imbalances that we're starting to see on multiple levels, on the individual worker level and worker power, on the tax and government level, on this, like, even our consciousness about whether Amazon is just always going to be there and we have absolutely no choice. And I don't know if anyone would like who would like to start in on that. I know that's a big question.
Sure, I'll start on that. Fulfillment, my book does not have that, sort of classic solutions chapter at the end. Decided not to include that, but the book does leave you with the implicit sense that one way to deal with this extraordinary concentration of power, economic power in this one company, is that, at least in the U.S., that we have to get much more serious about antitrust, and take on not just Amazon but the other tech giants in some form, as we actually are starting to see happening now in Washington. Just a couple of days ago, there was a whole series of bills put forth coming out of the House to address at least some of the problem of these monopolies and quasi-monopolies. And one of the insights I like to think in my book is how that concentration of economic power, market concentration of various sectors in the U.S. is tied to regional concentration of wealth and prosperity, and that those huge disparities that have had such a deleterious effect on our politics in the U.S. and have just made both sets of cities, both sets of places, so really difficult to live in for very different reasons, that is tied to the economic concentration problem. And that if we could, if you can just somehow rein in these giants, break them up, somehow disperse them to some degree, that you'll end up with a healthier balance, sort of healthier economic ecosystem around the country. But that's at the national level. At the local level, I would just say that governments do have to realize that they do actually have more say when the Amazon comes to town than they think. That again, because the company has to be just everywhere now, because we're now at the point where we as consumers are demanding so much from them, and so with such instant gratification that in fact precisely because they have to be everywhere, towns and cities have more leverage than they realize in negotiating with them over tax breaks or citing decisions or what have you. And then finally, at the consumer level, I do believe that we do still have agency, and that yes, there are all these larger forces working on us, larger forces of technology and the economy, but we do have agency. One reason that the reason why the company grew by 40%, the sales grew by more than 40% in the US this past year, why they had to expand their warehouse space by 50%, hire 400,000 more people. I mean, Anna mentioned that there were 5 new warehouses coming into the UK. We got 2 more. We're getting 2 more just here in Baltimore at the one site that I described in the book, the former steel mill at Sparrows Point. And since the book closed last fall, 2 more are opening up there. It's just incredible, the growth, and that's us. That was us doing that, and such a big question moving forward now is going to be whether the consumer decides to not to boycott or go cold turkey, but somehow moderate this behavior, that moderate the sort of attachment to the one-click life, and because we are the ones driving. At the end of the day, we are the ones driving the workers in these algorithmic models. I mean, it's when the robot comes to the picker on the floor, bringing that whole tower of drawers and shelves with all the goods, and the workers now in a way being driven by the robot who's bringing them the goods to be picked, and we're the ones driving the robot. And we have to keep that in mind. That at the end of the day, it is us and our desires that are driving that machine.
Thank you. Those are great. I think the considerations for how we can sort of regain some of that power or that balance. And I know, Anna, I know your report actually has some very strong recommendations as well. And I'd love to hear those, especially since what I wrote really didn't really touch on the solution so much.
Yeah, I guess, no, that's so interesting, Alec. And I guess here, in a way, that work is super important in its own right, but it's also a lens through which we can really understand the impacts on people and communities, but also begin to respond to them. And it is a big question, like, where do you start? What do you do when you've got these sort of ubiquitous Amazonian practices within work, as well as sort of outside it and across countries? And indeed the world too, even changing sort of what counts as work, how work is valued, that it's intensified, changing human relationships, models for work. How do you, where really do you start, especially where a lot of these things are invisible, and it's so hard, which is why journalism like yours is so important, to access information about what's important. And sort of we did a survey on that sort of information gap and that information power asymmetry with the biggest retail union in the UK, and the results came back very clearly that 52% of the people who were surveyed didn't know how or why their data was used. 67% weren't confident about whether it was used to manage their performance, or to predict what they would do. 62% had experienced sort of problems with automated scheduling. So and it goes on. The list goes on. So where do you start? So we I guess in our report end up saying, but a way to respond to this is to really sharply think about work, and in particular think about the human experience, the experience of the workers, how it, what the changes are, and how this experience as a kind of centerpiece rather than as a sort of afterthoughts. And if you do that, if you focus on that, and if you really focus on making work and experience for them better, you can short circuit a lot of the issues that Alec has so well identified, now today, and also in his book. So we end up sort of going for sort of multi-policy pronged attack, which spans from introducing a new employment bill with some new, very specific new digital rights for workers that includes higher levels of consultation or involvement, sort of rights to human contact, right to disconnect, and various other things, and also recommends an Accountability for Algorithms Act, which introduces new corporate duties to be aware of and to assess adverse impacts, and then to respond to them, to make adjustments for adverse impacts found. So this is, and we go on and suggest that regulators can work more closely, and various other sort of more involved recommendations that I won't cover now. But we've also sort of to complement that, we've recommended that the government, and this as a principle works, I think, for the states as well, and perhaps your president may be just a little bit ahead on this point, that the Cabinet Office should initiate a collaborative cross-government work 5.0 strategy, really underpinned by human-centered design and use of technology, and sort of looking to the future as well as managing immediate risks. And the work standards, really better work standards, should be really embedded through government decision making, and departments and recovery packages and levelling up packages, new infrastructure projects, procurement, collective bargaining as well is super important. So we would need in order that they could fulfill their functions, their core functions, in the context which we've described, must be allowed to access members and potential members and to bargain. So we must repeal the anti-union laws too. We must innovate in a different way, because what we're describing is not real innovation. It's the intensification of work, it's the extraction of labour at top speed. And we add other things that we might be running out of time for, but do take a look at the report. We don't in this report go as far as tax, but that has to be part of it too.
I think we still have time, but so if you wanted to go in there, and I actually just wanted to maybe ask both of you this question. So in the report that I wrote, I think a couple of, I don't actually technically have recommendations, just sort of different ways of thinking about or approaching the issue. One is what you mentioned and what, Alex, you do, which is sort of documentation and sort of opening up the algorithm, opening up the fulfillment box per se, to actually see what is happening inside. And then the other one is sort of, I think, Anna, you kind of touch on this, but sort of the information. How do we reverse this information asymmetry? And then lastly, is there a way for workers to just basically say, just no more awful quotas, no more cameras in my face all the time, or even consumers saying, no more tracking me while I shop on Amazon 24/7 so that I end up buying 5 million things at once. I'm just wondering and putting it out there, do these problems have a solution as well that you can see?
I would just say to that yes, I think that there's going to be, so after the failure to organize in Alabama, you are still going to see actions toward organizing that are probably going to fall, for the time being at least, fall short of attempts at full elections in warehouses, because that experience was a reminder of just how difficult that is in the current context in the U.S. But you are still going to see a lot of workers trying to draw attention to the conditions by essentially kind of protesting, as you described, walkouts, sit-down strikes, just continuing to try to just draw broader notice to what actually is behind those warehouse walls. I would just, to some of Anna's good points about possible solutions in the UK, I would say that I have been speaking with some federal regulators here in the U.S. who are in the Biden administration, who are working on looking at all this and thinking about ways to address these problems, these warehouse condition problems in the U.S., where we of course have this tradition of regulators not having much say, so of course makes it more difficult. But some of the things that they are, I know that they're thinking about are can one perhaps make things somewhat less terrible by moving workers around more. So many of the injuries in the warehouses come from just the pure repetition, the repetitive stress of the various jobs. And if you could somehow encourage or require Amazon and similar logistics companies to bring more variety into the work, that might be helpful. But then at the end of the day, of course, the biggest issue is the rate quotas, the rate requirements. And apparently, I only learned this recently, but my understanding is that in Germany, it's somehow tougher for the company to discipline on the basis of rate. And I'm not sure what form that takes. I need to find out more about that, because that's such a key, and that is the key issue, really. That's what workers in Alabama and elsewhere were talking about most. It wasn't as pay so much as it was just the sheer, the incredibly high demands of the job. And this is so key that those demands are now being driven by the algorithms and by the robots. There's this notion, I think, that as workplaces become more robotic, more automated, that the work itself becomes more higher order, more human. And in Amazon, the reverse has happened. It used to be that the pickers would walk the floor on their own, looking for stuff in the shelves, and it was a tough job with a lot of walking, but you were sort of on your own doing it. Now the picker's standing there, the robot is bringing you the stack of shelves, and you're picking stuff out of the shelves as it's brought to you. You are being driven by the robot, essentially. You're having to respond to the robot's speed and demands. And that's happening across the warehouse and other contexts. And finally, I would just say that the stakes of this are so important, because this work is now certainly in the US, is now the new mass form of work. The way you used to go down to the factory, the mill, or the shopping mall to get a job when you just need a job, you are now going to the warehouse. It's now the second largest employer in the US. Almost 500,000 more people hired just last year. This has replaced the retail jobs, of course, that have gone away. It's work that is both more grueling than the retail jobs that it has replaced, and it less well paid and less purposeful, let's face it, than the factory jobs that it has more come to resemble. It's a whole new form of work, and we have to figure it out, because this is going to be the mass workforce option going forward.
Yeah, I think those are such important points, and agree that there have to be kind of, as a result of that, sort of national standards and global standards that cover the issues that we've raised. And what we really want is a race to the top rather than the other way around. Just looping back, Aiha, to your question about accountability. So our work for the Mind the Gap report found that there were some really challenging issues to effective accountability for workers in particular. And we should be seeing workers as kind of workers and citizens, as well as, of course, consumers themselves. So we found that decisions are really diffuse, that they span multiple organizations, that the language, the statistics really obscures human roles, and makes it difficult to understand or access. There's a growing information asymmetry, which we've all talked to, in various different ways, that the current ways of looking at things are limited. An example being that privacy is super important, but it's not the way in which, it's not the point to access what we've been talking about. Taking identification work is the most obvious example of that. So how do we? So do workers feel they've got a choice, as you said? Not at the moment. I mean, at the moment, I'd like to mention that we did different interviews in different parts of the country. Alec, you might be interested in this. So in Grimsby, we interviewed a worker, Tia, who was desperate for sort of part-time contract work with a major retailer on terms which we've described now. Whereas in London, an interviewee said that there was a very high turnover of that, and they were expecting it just to be a sort of temporary job and a stopgap. So the regional aspect was really pulled out there. So how do we redress this balance other than the things that we've already talked about? I mean, I would really point to laws as a starting point, because to sort of preempt the problems that we're identifying, that have already bubbled up, and that will get more severe if they're not dealt with, and that we should see perhaps law as well as a race to the top. Think about the first mover of an advantage of regulating this properly and clearly, for our industries as well as our citizens, and get into more of an international dialogue as well as a national one about the kind of areas that we begin to outline, and it's only an outline, in our Accountability for Algorithms Act.
Yeah, I want to pick up on two things that you mentioned. One was this. There's an opportunity here for really transnational, international cooperation, collaboration. At least, in my work in this, I'm seeing Europe, the EU, really influencing how the US is thinking about data privacy. And, the entire country isn't quite there yet, but there are individual states like California that are really pushing for this. But is it strong enough, and is there a space for the two sides to continue to work on something that's more comprehensive? And I think that that's something we should look forward to in the future, such that it's not a regionalism, continues to be a regionalism, because a regionalism in the US is partly a result of states' rights, right? And local municipalities doing whatever they can to sort of, either offer the same incentives or attracting companies from one state to another. So I think that's one. And we had a comment from someone in the audience, Ben Willis, who says, as a consumer, it's hard to know where to go apart from Amazon now. eBay is a little better ethically. So I we have about 2 minutes left. I just wanted to respond to that and say, this isn't the first time that we've been presented with this question. When Walmart was massive, the same question is, where else do we go besides Walmart? Or, and then there are monopolies that we have basically created a space so that isn't becoming the only choice. But we have 1 minute left. I want to say thank you to both Alec and Anna, but also give you quickly, if you have a quick, if you want to pitch your book, your report, or one statement to leave the audience with, or you can just say goodbye.
Oh, I'll start, and I'll just answer quickly that last point. We have been here before with other giants, Walmart, or going back even further, a century ago, to the monopolies like Standard Oil, mm-hmm. But when we were at those moments before, we took them on, and it wasn't just you can't shrug it away just because we've been here before. It was a problem when it was Standard Oil, and it's a problem now, and so we're now at that moment, and the question is, are we going to do anything about it? And fulfillment really tries to show you, everything behind that one click, and shows you why we need to take it on.
Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. I think that I guess I just to finish, I'm struck by the need for sort of further work, further research, further work, further thought, further collaboration too, sort of at all levels. So at the kind of firm levels, regional levels, national levels, and international levels. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you both to Alec and Anna, and the audience for listening. This was a great conversation, and I hopefully look forward to working with you in the future. And with that, I will return it to Nima. Thank you.